just thought it was nice and at least got an opportunity to see the man and speak a few words with him. But Stilwell was just so well qualified for this thing. And Chiang Kai-shek hated him, and he hated Chiang Kai-shek. But he was Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff. And he had command of the Chinese armies, which the Chinese resented very, very much. They didn't want to take orders from anyone. And I think all he wanted to do was to prepare for a war with the communists after the World War II was resolved, and he was stashing away everything he could get. Well, of course, what happened, the communists took everything away from him. Colonel Barry had a mission up in Yunnan with the Chinese communists, with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. And I have his paper that he wrote on that, and it's very interesting. Those people had nothing. They made weapons in caves, handmade weapons. We gave them nothing. And they probably killed more Japanese through most of the war than nationalist soldiers did, because we had a great deal of trouble getting them to fight. Stilwell had said that if you properly equipped and trained and led and fed the Chinese soldier, that he would be equal to any fighting man on earth. Now, it was a long time in proving that, but during the hard winter of 1944, and I'm talking from memory, and just what I've read after it, I didn't know anything about it then, there was a General Poe there who commanded about 500,000 men in China. And his army just melted away. But the 38th and the 22nd Division, the two of them I was familiar with, came in there and just beat the daylights out of the Japanese in that hard winter. The Japanese hadn't adequately prepared themselves for that, clothing and otherwise, for that hard winter. And I think that broke the back of the Chinese in central China. But it proved what Stilwell has said, that if they got the right kind of training and the right kind of leadership, they could do it. And they certainly proved it to us in Korea when we opposed them in Korea. But it was a long time doing it. They would get orders, even the outfit that I was, to do certain things, and they wouldn't do it. I know Sacerdoti and I, before I'd been out at Tagap for more than a week, we started with a patrol down to Shimwang, where the Japs were, and where General Wheeler had started to see about building an airport and didn't know they were there. He found out, though. And we started out with this company, a patrol of company strength, to go to Shimwang. And Sid and I were bringing up the rear. Well, about 1 o'clock, here comes the head of the column coming back. We never found out why they turned around and why they came back. They wouldn't tell us. But we were supposed to have gone all the way down and made contact, because our intelligence by that time had told us that there weren't that many Japs there. But we didn't. They just wouldn't say why they were going back. And Sid and I nearly got shot up going through the line. Sid says, "Oh, we'll go back ahead of them." And it was a mess, because he didn't communicate too well with the Chinese sentries any better than I did. And we tried to bypass them and slid in on a bunch of loose rock. If we'd known how many booby traps had been around there, we wouldn't have done it. But we didn't. We got in. We made it all right. But that was typical of how, even on a small operation like that, they would get orders to go to make a movement, and for no reason at all, they wouldn't make it. Well, other units were depending on them being there at that time, maybe a British unit or an American unit or something else. They just wouldn't show up. But finally they did get the act together and did pretty well. But so far as Chiang was concerned, he just wasn't. He never did really exhibit any great evidence that he was actually on our side wholeheartedly. And when we had to take over the supply operations, you can imagine being a second lieutenant, green as a gourd, out there on the end of that, and there I am dealing with Chinese colonels and generals, speaking for my general. But he's not there, I'm there.
I'm getting a 5-minute warning. Let me ask you, how old were you when you joined the service?
Well, when I joined the service, let's see, in 41, I was 26. And when I got back, I was about 30.
Well, I wish
I was older than most of them over there, and you really began to notice that difference, too.
But I think you needed those added years, though, didn't you, that maturity to get you through this?
I think the good Lord was just with me because I did so many things wrong, Lynn. It's just unbelievable. And this thing that Nevin taped for me, when I had to give it a title, I called it Square Peg in a Round Hole because I think that's what I was. But there were a lot of us over there. They called it the CBI. They said it meant confusion beyond imagination, and that was really it. And if you get someone who can talk about the big picture, it was. If we had known what was going on, if we'd known what the big picture was, I think we would have all died of fright over there. We didn't know how bad it was, but it was terrible. But I'll never forget the shock I got when they said, "This is the word you send if you think they're about to change sides on us."
And what was that?
Traitor.
Traitor. This is cassette number 3, Mr. John Allen. The date is May 13th, 1993. What do you mean?
Recording.
What did you say?
So you must have done a lot of recording.
Oh, I have. Yes. Now I guess I better put my glasses on though, so we can get. And we'll kind of run down these. I've checked the ones that I think we might want to talk about. We talked about when you joined the service and the fact that you volunteered. And why did you join the branch of the service that you did? Did we mention that?
I had no option at all on that. At that time, they were putting you where they wanted you. And you took what you got. And at the time, I thought, well, this is just for 1 year. What difference does it make? I had a lot of reading and interpreting aerial photographs. The Department of Agriculture had started using them for land measurement, and I worked a lot on that, so I thought, well, maybe that will be where I could be of some value. Was never mentioned again.
No.
So we went where they told us to, and that was it.
All right, what do you remember about leaving home? And there's some more to this. How old were you, and was anyone else in your family in the service? And also, was your home here in Tennessee?
Yes, my home was at Dixon Springs, Tennessee, and I was born in the same house I still have, where my father and his brothers and sisters were born, and his mother and most of her brothers and sisters were born. The old house was built in 1833.
And so that's where you left from?
That's where I left. I had quit work several times and couldn't find out when I would be inducted. They had drafted so many people that they didn't have room for volunteers, so I had to wait. And I volunteered when they called up the Guard in the previous fall of 1940. But it was the 15th of May of 41 before I actually left home.
And how old were you then?
Well, let's see, I was 26.
And was anyone else in your family in the service?
Shortly after that, the two brothers who come after me, one 3 years younger and one a little over 4 years younger. Webb was getting a master's degree at the University of Alabama, and my brother Bill was just completing his degree at fourth year at Alabama, and Bill was an ROTC, so he went in as a second lieutenant right after graduation in 41. And Webb went in, I think, pretty soon after that. Bill wound up in the Pacific. He was loaded on ship to go to the Philippines when Pearl Harbor happened, and they unloaded and waited around a few days and then went to Hawaii, then to Australia. Then they went through the New Guinea campaign. He was in the 24th Division and through Leyte and all the Philippine campaign, and then wound up in Japan after the war. My brother Webb went to the Middle East and North Africa and was over there for a long time.
So, with your family, you pretty well covered the world, didn't you?
And then my youngest brother, who's 15 years younger than I am, was just old enough for Korea. So when he got his degree at TPI, he went into the Army for nearly 5 years in the Korean War. That took all of us.
This next question, we did talk about this a little. Describe the places where you trained and where you went from there. And you did talk about Fort Barrancas, I know. and I believe you covered your training
Yes.
pretty well. And then had you been to different parts of the country before?
Well, I had not traveled extensively in this country, but most of my travels had been in the South. I don't think I'd been very far north of Washington, D.C., and, not farther west than Arkansas. So all of my travels have been in the South, but I was pretty familiar with the South, but nowhere else.
Did you mention what units you were part of and what your duties were? And
we went in to Fort Barrancas, which was headquarters for the 13th Coast Artillery Regiment, and we were assigned to the headquarters detachment. And they told us when we got there that I think there were 22 or 23 of us. We were the only ones there who were not regular Army.
I remember you mentioned
And they said, you're going to do what we don't want to do, expect no promotions or anything else. I never went anywhere for basic training. I didn't go through that. This regiment furnished personnel for what they call the Panama Coast Artillery Detachment. They rotated groups from Florida to Panama. And usually when those non-coms came back, they could take it easy until they went back to Panama. Well, this time they said every afternoon you're going to have to give these recruits what's supposed to go for basic training. Well, we got very little training. But we dug lots of ditches. We did lots of menial chores. The base surgeon there had volunteered to come in from retirement, and he was an old buddy of my uncle who was an Army doctor, and they were doctors together in the Philippines during the Moro campaign. He saw my name, and then he drafted me for this job as medical supply sergeant there. So I actually wound up there in the medical department. But I was only there about 14 months, I think, until I got there in May, and of the following year, at the end of June, I went to OCS. There again, I had applied for either field artillery or ordnance, because at that time I was sort of a gun freak and liked to fool with guns. And I was very disappointed when I was told I was going to the quartermaster school at Fort Lee. And I told them I didn't want to go there. They said, well, that class will be divided between the graduates who want to will be in the ordnance and the others will be in quartermaster. So I'd even gone so far as to buy my ordnance and else with what little money I had. On graduation, the day before graduation, we found out that everyone who had applied for ordnance was in QM and vice versa. They told us they would change it. They never did. Well, I never did really have strictly quartermaster duties, but being assigned as supply officer with the Chinese was pretty close to it. But since I had concentrated on ordnance courses in OCS, I didn't really know much about what was going on in the quartermaster end of it, but it wasn't too hard to find out. So I never had any training for what I did. The jobs I had were not at all related to any training or civilian experience or anything I ever had, which was true of a lot of people.
I know. Now, I know there were people from other parts of the country that you associated with in your unit, but what did you think of them and how were they different from you?
Well, they were not too different. I was with people from pretty well all over the country after I got to Benning and, of course, at OCS. When I was at Florida, I was with mostly Southern boys. But after I got in the truck regiment that worked for the infantry school at Fort Benning, I was with people from all over the United States. And I didn't find any problem with that. That was no problem at all. They kidded me about being a rebel, and I kidded them about being a damn Yankee. So that was never a problem. And it was amazing how little difference there was. Now, some of the boys from the Bronx and places like that were different. Most of the people that I was in contact with had some sort of a rural background, which helped a lot. And people with a farm background or from small towns, and not too much difference. So that part of it was never a problem. In fact, I think it was good for me.
Did you ever wonder what you were doing in the service and why you were there?
I certainly did. At first, it was just a lark to go for a year. And I had a wonderful time at Fort Barrancas, Florida. That was like you had to be in the Army. That was a country club. And you could get a 3-day pass if you'd been a good boy most any time you wanted it. And I had friends in Mobile and would go over there, and relatives too. So it was very nice. But after that, it changed. Being an officer put you in a different position too, all of a sudden. And I found out how little influence a second lieutenant had. That was the lowest form of life in the eyes of most people. So it was at Fort Benning. I really didn't get into the duties of a truck officer at all. We were not there long enough for me to really learn much about that. And as a new second lieutenant, you were immediately given all of the jobs that none of the other officers wanted. You became mess officer and supply officer and morale officer and everything else that no one else wanted to fool with. So I was not really prepared to be a truck officer when I went overseas. In fact, I really wasn't trained for anything. And then when I volunteered to go with the Chinese, I was really out of my depth. But I didn't know what I was volunteering for, so that I couldn't be blamed for that.
Now, I know on the other tape, we talked about what you planned to do after the war was over, and you went back to the Department of Agriculture. Right. Is that correct? And then, let's see. And we talked about. I asked you, I think, about if you had any feelings about the people of draft age who were not in the service. Did we talk about that?
No.
Maybe not. All right. What were your feelings about those?
I didn't have, my feelings were not too strong early on because I was just getting the year over with, and I had seen what a struggle the Army was having in dealing with the people they had drafted. At the time I went overseas, they still weren't capable of handling all of them. We were ill-equipped and ill-trained. That we just had more people than we could really train and supervise. After that, while I was overseas, the things that infuriated me more than anything else was to read in the few magazines and newspapers we'd get about people being on strike. I know that just infuriated me worse than anything else. And I still remember John L. Lewis's picture on a copy of one of the magazines we got in the coal miners striking. And the idea of people striking for higher wages when we went for a very low pay. I got $21 a month when I went in. And I'll never forget the first payday I got. It was for 15 days, and they had deducted for insurance, and they made you buy a ticket for laundry and to buy stuff at the PX and the movie and so forth. And the first sergeant, when he went to give me my pay, he took his fingers and spun a $50 across the pay table, and it made a figure 8. And he said, "Son, don't blow it all on liquor and women." That was my total pay.
50 cents?
50 cents. Well, you see, our total pay would have been $21 a month. Well, they deducted for all these other things, so there was nothing left. And I started making nickel side bets on somebody who was on a hot roll in a crap game, up to a quarter, and wound up with $18 and a half. I had more money than any of my buddies. That's the only luck I ever had in gambling like that. But we got by on $21 a month. And when you finally made private first class, which I think after a month or two, it was automatic, you got it. We got $36. And then I got to be private first class specialist, fourth class, while I was at Fort Barrancas. And when I got promoted to corporal, I had to take a cut of $4 to $6, I can't remember which, in a month. And I tried to not accept the promotion, and they wouldn't let me do it. But I hated to give up that money.
Well, why? If you were getting promoted, why would they deduct? Just more deductions or something?
No, that was just the way the crazy pay scale worked. They had these specialist ratings that you could get, and I could have gotten more than that as a private first class, but I didn't. And I finally got all the way up to buck sergeant, and that's as far as I got enlisted rank.
Well, we talked about this a little bit, but let's dwell on this a little more. How did the war affect you, and how did it change you? And do you think it changed the country?
Yes, it did. I think all of our major social and economic advances have taken place after war, following wars. And the country's changed, the people have changed. Well, it mixed us all up. We got to know people from other areas that we were talking about. And we got to see things that we had never seen before, and we got more concerned about our country and what was going to happen and what we could do to stay out of war. All the things we'd heard about, the war to end wars and everything else, and how we were never going to do it again. And yet, in a very few years, we were in Korea, and then we were in Vietnam, and we've been somewhere ever since. So it had a big effect on us. It broadened our knowledge about everything, I think. At least it did for me. I saw things in an entirely different perspective, and I got more interested in what was going on in the world and why, and what we could do maybe to stay out of trouble like that again, which is one reason I stayed in the organized reserve.
What do you remember most about coming home, and how had things changed?
Well, coming home was it's sort of like a blur to me. At first, it took us 55 days at sea, plus a long delay in Calcutta waiting for a ship, and then I had to hitchhike from up near the China border to Calcutta. But things moved fast after that. As I told you, I'd been engaged to Eula, my wife, before I left, and had talked her into waiting. I got to San Francisco on the 28th of June, 1945. I got to Atlanta on the 6th of July. They let me leave there the next day, the 7th. I got off the train that night at Mobile, and Eula met me, and the first thing she said was, "We're getting married on the 10th. I said, "My God, the laws of the Catholic Church," and she was Catholic then, I wasn't at the time. And the state of Alabama won't permit that. She says, "It's all fixed. You're not getting away again." So getting married was a big blur. I had time to get, mother got to come down for the wedding. And but we had all of the parties and everything, but I had no clothes to wear. I had run out of clothes. I never did have many, and it was so hot on the ship, we'd cut the legs off the breeches and the sleeves out of the shirts. I got to San Francisco wearing the same suit of khakis I'd worn since Eniwetok, and on the little short leave I had in Hawaii, I had to wear that one all the way to Mobile. In San Francisco, I don't know what they were saving clothing for, but they did sell me a tropical worsted uniform, but it was 3 sizes too big. In Atlanta, they sold me 2 tropical worsted shirts and a pair of trousers. And I had a grass sack full of dirty clothes, and Eula's mother's maid took them to launder, and a friend who had a clothing store there got his tailor to stay up all night altering the shirts and uniform that I had bought so that I would have clothes to be married in. See, it just had 3 days to get ready for this. Mm-hmm. So the maid came back the next morning and says, "I have some bad news." Says, "Everything that wasn't ragged was mildewed." Says, "I didn't get much out of that grass sack full of stuff." So I started out my honeymoon pretty ragged. Eula had a car, but 5 other people rode to work in it every morning, so we didn't think it'd be right to take the car. And mine was back in Tennessee, and Dad was using it because it had broken down. So after a great deal of difficulty, one of Eula's friends had a boss who kept a room reserved all the time at the new Hotel Biloxi. So we went all the way to Biloxi for our honeymoon on the train. So things moved pretty fast, and I had orders assigning me to duty in Atlanta after my 30 days leave was up. The day before my leave was up, that order was canceled, and I was sent to Fort Sam Houston. So the nice apartment that my kinfolks had found for me in Atlanta, I had to give up, and I never was in Fort Sam Houston, but I wasn't there too much longer. I left there and was relieved from active duty in mid-October in 45.
So, did she get to go with you, or did she have to
No,
stay?
she just had to visit out there. She was still working.
Oh, yeah.
She was a nurse and was superintendent of a large industrial hospital for Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company. And they fussed a lot when she left, but she did. She came to Nashville, never worked again.
Well, I believe that that's really all. We talked earlier about what we could have done better during the war. I remember you mentioned that, but maybe you'd like to say some more about
I don't know
that.
what we could have done better. At the time, it seemed like a lot of things were wrong. In our theater, we had the lowest priority for supplies of any theater in the war. We needed everything. I didn't know what bad shape we were in until after the war, and reading about some of the problems Stilwell had trying to get troops, trying to get supplies. We never had an American division in the whole theater. We had the Merrill's Marauders and later on the Mars Task Force, and the Merrill's Marauders were all people who had volunteered for one more mission, and they sort of scraped the guardhouse in a few places and took misfits and whatnot to put in that. They did very well, though. And they were replaced by people who were mostly from the 124th Cavalry from down at Brownsville, Texas. I can't think of the name of the post. And they were dismounted, of course. They didn't have their horses. They gave them some mules, but no horses. So they were the only combat troops we had. Mostly the American force over there was primarily Air Force and the units to support it, and the engineers and the truck regiments to build and haul supplies over the Lido Road, or Stilwell Road, it's called both. And we had a lot of makeshift stuff. We never had enough trucks. We never had enough tires. We never had enough anything. One of the great decisions that was made was to build a pipeline to supply gasoline and motor oil for the operation, and that followed the road. As the road constructed, that pipeline went along with it. And for a while, we hauled gasoline from the end of that line to the only tank outfit that we had. Colonel Rothwell Brown, a regular Army officer, assigned to Chilway headquarters, and he was nearly always out of gas and out of ammunition when we got there with the trucks. They were all, except for his advisors, they were all Chinese, the tankers were.
Well, you were going to tell me some more about actually building the road, too.
Well, when we got there, I'd gone over with a truck regiment. The road went only as far as the Burma border, maybe just a little over. A place called Hell's, we nicknamed it Hell's Gate. It's actually Patcoy Pass, and I wrote those names down. And a very mountainous area there going into Burma. It was raining. The monsoon had started when I was there. It took me 7 days to get to my post in Burma. We had to walk all the way after we got to Hell's Gate. We did ride that far, but it took all day to get there, and it was maybe 30 miles or less. The road was just a quagmire, and the soil in those mountains was much like what we've seen on our Cumberland Mountains. You know, the slides we used to have between here and Chattanooga up around Mont Eagle, the road stayed closed most of the time. Same thing when they built I-40 through up by Kingsport, not Kingsport, but Kingston and Harriman and places up in East Tennessee. The soil did not percolate. It would hold the water. And when the engineers would make a cut along the mountainside, why, it would get wet and just slide off. The road would close. We lost men when their trucks were pushed over the side by slides. It was a very, very hard road to build. There are places on that road where trucks and machinery were covered by a sliding mountain and rusting away there today. The engineers made a lot of false starts, I guess, and they had to do the engineering for this in a hurry. Normally, the engineers would have spent 2 or 3 years planning a road like that in this country. But then they had to do it all from scratch and right now. And we didn't have to experience it in that part of the world. So the remarkable thing is that they built the road. The living conditions were very, very hazardous. Malaria was everywhere. Now, the troops back at base were getting Atabrine, which was a suppressant and kept you from getting malaria. It did turn you yellow. I didn't even know about it until after Christmas of 43, and I already had malaria. But after I started taking that, I didn't have it again until, about a month and a half after I quit taking it when I got home. So malaria was a big, big problem. Then dysentery, you could not drink any water, no matter how clear and pretty the mountain stream was. You would get either bacillary or amoebic dysentery or both. That was one of the big problems we had. Leeches were everywhere, and you could lose a tremendous amount of blood from those things, and at that time we had no insect repellent. Later on we got something called scat, which worked pretty good. Scat was about as bad as the bugs, but at least you didn't bleed. So they were a problem. And there were a lot of very false stories put out about how the engineers had to fight off the Japs and fierce head-hunting Nagas and things like that. I remember a correspondent named Martin wrote some stories that came back, and I met the guy and had a little run-in with him. But that was before I'd seen any of the stuff that he wrote. And he said the boys driving the bulldozers on the road had to drive the bulldozers with one hand and hold a rifle or a carbine with the other to fight off the fierce head-hunting Nagas and their crossbows. Well, I never knew a Naga to commit a hostile act against anyone. That was just a flat-out lie. But that was typical of the type of things that our correspondents were sending home. Well, of course, my family just got terribly upset about it. They thought, well, I hadn't been telling them about it. And I never convinced them, even after I got home. They said, well, we know you were not telling us the truth. You just didn't want us to know how bad it was. But the living conditions were bad. Boys complained about the food, but the food was remarkably good. Of course, we had our K rations and C rations for emergency use, but one of the things that we got out where I was first, we got lots of canned corned beef. A lot of it came from Argentina, some of the South American countries, but it was good. It was put up by, at least it had an American brand name on it. When I was with the Chinese, I ate rice. We got some canned vegetables. Mostly we had diced carrots. It's hard to eat a diced carrot today. Another one was beet tops called silver beets, which had a lot of sand in it. We did get fruit cocktail, canned fruit cocktail, which is very good. Occasionally we would get canned peaches. The Chinese, when they were dropped on the field, they'd punch a hole in the can, drink the juice, and throw it away. They wasted more than half of the stuff that they got. But they had never seen anything like that before, and they really enjoyed it, but they wasted more than they'd get a big can big enough for 20 people and punch a hole in it with a bayonet and drink the juice and throw it away. So we did get canned fruit, but we did not get any dried fruit, and we didn't get onions, things like that. Now, back at base headquarters and throughout India, they got different rations from what folks up at the front got. There's no doubt about it. And Dr. Seagrave is probably responsible for me and a lot of others being alive today. He saw we were about to have an outbreak of scurvy, so he had us start sprouting beans. Even then, they were not giving beans to the Chinese to sprout, so we started sprouting beans, soybeans. We got the little mung bean, the little small soybean, and eating the bean sprouts kept us from having scurvy, and of course we enjoyed the bean sprouts. We did not get much to eat out of the jungle. In fact, one time when I tried, it was out of food for 2 or 3 days. My friends Will Wallace and I were nearly 3 days. And we couldn't find anything we could eat in the jungle. Everything we ate tried to eat made us sick. And
I'm going to have to. All right.
You could walk in a dense jungle all day long and not hear an animal sound or a bird peep or anything else. The thing we saw mostly was monkeys, or in Burma, the small gibbon apes. They would come right up to you, sometimes actually looked like they tended to be hostile. But we did eat them occasionally, and once you shot one, then they got very wise and they were hard to get close enough to shoot them. I know I used up all my bullets one day trying to get one. But there were a few deer that could be had occasionally, but the Chinese ate everything that, whether it bled or not. They would eat anything from a snake or whatever. We got some fish out of the rivers, but the Americans and the Chinese fished for them with explosives, so the poor river fish were exhausted. They were gone and nothing flat. They'd blast them to pieces. Occasionally a deer. They had a small barking deer that I saw occasionally, and then in some places they had the large deer, the sambal, which is about as big as our elk. I never got to shoot one of those. Occasionally you'd see a brown bear, and the only one I ever shot was so sick looking that I gave him to the Chinese. I didn't want any of him, but I know when whales were out in the jungle, we couldn't find anything to eat. And I remembered what I'd heard some professor at Vanderbilt was talking to a group of us down at the Y, and he said no country was more than 9 meals removed from a revolution. And I suddenly remembered that. And what he was trying to tell us was that if you'd been without food for 3 days and you still had the will to live, you would do anything on God's green earth to get it. You even wonder in your own mind, admit later on, you're wondering if it came to it, if you'd cook old buddy a little or eat him raw if you had to. Yeah. You lose all of your scruples, all of your sense of values. And I had never seen anyone really hungry before, but when I got to India, when I got to Bombay and saw the abject poverty of the people there who would do anything for a scrap of food and dying of starvation on the streets amid all of the opulence that you saw in those rich cities. And it was hard for us to realize how desperate people were for food. And I think that made a bigger impression on me than anything else in India was the callousness of the British administrators and British people who lived there. They could have cared less. They didn't give a damn whether they died or not. They had too many of them. They thought, well, let them die off. I'll tell you that. But the mad rush for food was something that I wasn't ready for. The Nagas in their villages, and the Kachins too, all had little gardens. But land was so dear, they had to cut with knives, just like this one you saw hanging on the wall, the da. They had no axes. They would use them to cut a large tree. Usually they would pile the smaller trees around it and burn it and let it fall down. And they made those rough clearings on the mountainsides and planted their little crops in between the stumps. They grew some of the same vegetables we do. They grew eggplant, was one I remembered I got occasionally. Even remember what they called it in North Burma. It was called brinjal, like B-R-E-N-J-W-L. And occasionally some little corn nubbins you would see, and but not very much in the way of vegetables. Onions they grew, chili peppers they grew. But they didn't have much ground, and by the time they grew their rice, which in those places was non-irrigated rice, it was delicious. It was oily, in fact. But they were hard put to grow enough to live on. And with the torrential rains they had, it rained in that part of the world from 150 inches a year up. A lot of the stuff would just simply wash away. They were devastated by that, or maybe the monsoon would end a little early. And when it got dry there, it got so dry the streams dried up. Streams that just you thought would never go dry would be dry. We nearly ran out of water at Tagap. I know we were getting ready for the build-up to go into Burma in the late summer of '43, and our one spring, which was our sole source of supply, was about dry. So we had gotten canvas tanks to save the water, and we had a bamboo water line that ran from the spring throughout the camp, and we had armed guards patrolling that thing. People would steal water from it. They'd just lift up a joint and fill their canteen and let it run out on the ground. And we heard that a pack outfit was coming in. And I sent word down the foot of the mountain where there was still some stagnant pools in the Nam-Young River, but whatever he did, not to bring the mules up there. Well, if I ever see that major again, I think I'd strangle him on sight. He paid no attention to it. The mules came up there, broke loose, and ran and collapsed one of the water tanks. Fortunately, we beat them off of the other one. So we nearly...
Contaminated the water.
No, well, we lost it.
Oh, yeah.
We lost it. It just ran out on the ground. Those canvas tanks just collapsed.
Yes.
And we lost the water. Fortunately, we did get a rain quicker than we expected. Otherwise, we would have had thousands of people there with no water. They're in a jungle in land where it rains more than 150 inches a year. But it just gets so dry, and it gets so dry so quick. On the road, I have seen 4 inches of dust like talcum powder on top of a foot of mud. And that's unbelievable. I know when I came out of Burma the first time, they made me fly with the airdropping missions and so forth, and I think I told you about that earlier. But I had a full beard. And yet I'd forgotten I even had it. But coming back from the airport one day on that dust, I felt like I had all of India on my face, and if I hadn't gotten to a place where I could cut it off, I would have pulled it out. And I never had any desire to have a beard after that.
The knife you referred to, which is hanging on your wall, was that given to you, or did you just find that around somewhere?
That was given to me, and I'm sure that I got some things that I wouldn't have gotten had I not been the man in charge of rations and opium. I was the one. I was the big do-off for them, the big boss, and so that was one of the things that they gave me. We dealt with the head men of each tribe, and they started out by bringing you gifts, which was customary. So I was hard put to find gifts for them in return. And then I found out that things like salt and sugar and any kind of medicine were the greatest things you could give them. We paid them in silver money. We paid a rupee a day, about 30 cents, if they didn't smoke opium. If they smoked, we paid them 3/4 of a rupee, and enough opium for 2 pipes a day. The British were horrified at that. They said that was 10 times more than we should have given them. Their going rate in India was 8 cents a day. Said they preferred to pay them at that rate, which is what the pre-war rate was, and subsidize the food that they bought rather than raise the pay, because after the war they would want to still get the high pay. So, but they didn't like it, but we did it anyway. However, we had very few who, as time went on, fewer and fewer claimed not to be smokers. So I smelled a lot of Naga breath and looked at a lot of pupils in the eyes to see whether they were lying or not, as to whether or not they smoked. We'd say, Gani Luai, that meant, do you smoke? And they would say, Luai Dua, which meant that they smoked. Once in a while, one would say, Lua, smoke. And you always ask him twice to make sure that he knew what he was saying.
Something else hanging on your wall, the bag. Would you explain about that,
Well,
how it was woven, what it's made from?
People have asked me how the Nagas dressed. It depended on where they were. They inhabited the mountainous area on either side of the Assam-Burma border, and maybe far down as Imphal between India. I don't think that was in Assam. But all along the India-Burma border. Their origin was originally in Tibet, the same as the Kachins. And I think they came out at different times, different migrations from Tibet into Burma. And I think the Nagas was the one that came down and started back. One of them did, but they stayed there along the border. They had been enslaved. I knew many of them who had been slaves, some of the older men, and that they were taken as children. Slavery was had supposedly been abolished about 20 or 30 years before, but that was just when it was declared illegal, and it was hard to administer that area. In fact, there was really no policing out there other than what was done by the Kachins. Well, since the Kachins would be the one who wanted the slaves, they weren't enforcing it too well. So you found a lot of them who had been slaves. And they wore the clothing. Well, I think somebody asked Kipling about the little boy, and he said, not very much in front and less than half as much behind, or something like that. Well, that's about, some of them wore only a G-string or like that, especially if they're walking along the road. Others wore pieces of European clothing. I know they would make ornaments and buttons out of the silver coins we gave them. The women also wore the wraparound skirt called a longi, L-O-N-G-I, I guess would be a good way to spell it. And they wore different types of jackets, and the women would wear the longi up above the breast most of the time, but when it got very hot, it went down to the waist. And I found them to be very good people. They had, even though the tribes didn't speak the same language, they had a moral code that they might not have been good by our standards, but they rigidly enforced it. And their version of adultery was punishable by death. They had, the only religion they had was a spirit worship. They were animists. And if there were any good spirits, I never found out about them. They called spirits the Nats, N-A-T-S, and they were all evil spirits. And they did things to keep the evil spirits from bothering them. They had been headhunters. You read people writings now who say they saw the heads in their buildings and so forth. I don't know whether that happened or not. I saw no evidence of it. But the refugee trail out of Burma, the one I went in on, was literally covered with thousands of skulls. Well, when the Nagas found out that the GIs wanted heads and skulls, all they had to do was go out on the trail and get them. I know one picture that's been widely circulated shows a rack of skulls out in front of the village. Well, they put them over on the posts in the houses when they used to take them. And each one of them had a bullet hole in there. Well, that was either people who had been massacred by the skulls of people who had been massacred by the Japanese, or probably the Chinese, or maybe each other. And they had rumors, that's where they made a hole to suck the brains out of the skulls. But there was all sorts of exaggerated things like that. I was at one place where they were having a little ceremony in a Naga village, and they had killed a man from a neighboring village who'd come in to steal one of the girls. And they had kept an arm, and it had been dried up, but I asked them what that was. It was scattering over the fields to make them fertile, and it was where they chopped up the man's arm. That's the nearest I saw of anything like that. It's probable that some of them, the more remote tribes, may have done it. Usually it happened when one stole a girl from the other village, and then they would seek revenge. But I found no evidence of it myself. But when they found out how they were being publicized as being big headhunters and fierce headhunters, why, I think a lot of them thought, well, we'll just get rich on a good thing here. We'll go out and you could find all the skulls you wanted, so they'd find them skulls, and there's probably boys that brought them home. But
well, did the women have anything to do with the men in your group, or did the men have anything to do with the women?
Well, I'm sure they did. We didn't have any problem with it with my old group. They were very friendly. And Seagrave's hospital there, his nurses were, they called them Burmese nurses, but of that group, none of them were actually Burmese. They were from the different tribes. Some of them might have been one of the Indian races, and I think there are about 50 different ethnic groups, distinct ethnic groups in India. But they were Kachin or Shan or Karen, and I think one or two of them were Nagas. They were all very nice girls, and some of the boys did date them. And I know one man was going to marry one of them, but they didn't get married. I found out living over at Columbia, South Carolina. He's a retired colonel. And I want to find out why he didn't marry that pretty little girl, Chit Sin, one of the most beautiful girls you ever saw, very light complexion as Sean, and just pretty as she could be. So they did fraternize with the girls. But the moral code there with the Nagas in my area, I'm sure it varied, when girls reached the age of puberty, they went to live in the house of the unmarried girls. I think it's called Makoni Onda. And don't ask me to spell that. But anyway, it meant the house of the unmarried girls. They would come there to live, and the boys would go there to pay court to the girls. And if they liked each other, they could live together. They could become engaged. But before they could become engaged, the boy had to make a down payment on the girl with his father. Well, sometimes he had a limited time to pay all of the money, and if he didn't, or if he missed a payment, why, he was out and she was back on the market. And when they would eventually marry. Well, if she had anything to do with any other man while they were engaged, I guess you'd say, well, that was considered adultery. And that was punishable by death. Now, the British had outlawed that, but I was told that it was still probably enforced. So they had a very, very strict unwritten laws and moral codes like that. All of the government in those villages was done by the elders, the old people. The head man was not an inherited position. He was selected by the elders, and usually he was the strongest, brightest man in the village. So they did a good job of that. When you'd see them building a house or anything, you'd see the old men. I asked my head man, Peter Kaluyam, I said, what are we doing with all those old men on the payroll? He says, they're telling the others what to do. Says they won't do anything until they tell them, and that says they approve it. It says, you see, they just made that one go back and replace all those ties he didn't have put on tight enough. So everything was governed by the Council of Elders, which I thought was a very good system. The fact that they could live in that country was remarkable, but they did.
Now, let me see how much tape I've got left. Well, I've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like for you to tell me, I think the tape stopped in our last session before you got to tell me about riding bareback on the elephant, and I'd like to have you tell me that, and then anything else you'd like to say in the next 10 minutes.
We'll try to get this one in a hurry. When the Japanese were going to break through, and did eventually break through at a place called Kohima, that's the only time they got into India that I know of, they began to try to make combat soldiers out of all of the service and supply soldiers around the base installations there at Lido and other places. Someone knew that there was an isolated Kachin village up the Tarap River from Lido, which was where General Boatner's headquarters was. And they thought that the Japs might be up there. It was a foolish thing to think. There would be no reason for them to be there. And they wanted to send a patrol up there to see it, and they couldn't find anyone to speak Chingpo. And someone said, oh yes, Lieutenant Allen is back, and he speaks fluent Chingpo, which was not true. I had very, very little. So I could not get out of going, and I was sick. I was still sick and skinny as I could be, and I suggested we go upriver, but for some reason they wouldn't let us go up the river. And they arranged for elephants to carry us. I think there were 8 or 10 of us in the group, including one major, but he was told that he had nothing to do to go along for the ride, that I was in charge. That didn't sit too well with him, but we were going to ride elephants because the trail led through an impenetrable swamp. It was very hot, very muddy. We had to ride the elephants bareback. You could not use the howdahs or the baskets because the brush would pull you off. We fell off many times, and the elephant and the driver would have the elephant kneel down and take his trunk and help you back up. We were wearing shorts because it's easier to see the leeches on you and get them off if you don't have too many clothes. There are hairs on an elephant's back that are just about like needles. They're very uncomfortable, especially after 4 days there and 4 days back. And then you realize how you stretched out you are riding an elephant bareback. You've heard about being saddle sore. Well, that's nothing till you've ridden an elephant bareback. It's just unbelievable what that does to you. Well, I explained to all of them that if the Japs were in this village, that we would be dead because they could hear those elephants. The sound of an elephant pulling his foot out of that mud almost sounds like guns going off. and crashing through the brush too. There's no way you can move quietly on an elephant through the jungle. At least I didn't know about it. So I said, when the first thing we'll see is a string that stretches all around the villages, that's to keep out the knots, the spirits, and maybe a little shrine of some kind. But I said, when we get there, I'll show you how to remove the string and go in. But we're not likely to see anyone there when we get there, because if the Japs there, they'll open up on us. And if the Japs aren't there, the people will get out of the way and stay away until they see who's there. Well, that's what happened. We got in, the place was deserted, but the fires were still warm. I'll start searching, and I said, no, we'll sit down and cook some rice and make some tea and appear as unconcerned as we can be. And after about 30 minutes, I heard a little sound behind me. And when I turned around, there was this little boy looked like 8 or 9 years old, standing ramrod straight. And in my best Chingpo, I said what I thought was, are you Kachin? And he says, hell no, I'm an American Baptist Christian in perfect American English. And I thought, my God, I wasted the whole trip. I came along because I spoke a little Chingpo, and the only person we see speaking in American English. Missionaries had been there before the war and had stayed a little too long. A few of the people came back in, but not very many. There were no Japs there, so we went through the ordeal of going all the way back. And because I was so damn knowledgeable about the language, I had to make that trip for nothing. And then we run in, and he had a Boy Scout belt buckle.
Well, tell me, the road finally got built, didn't it? But wasn't the war almost over by that time?
No, the war would not have been over without the road, because we couldn't have moved the stuff and the people and the material. We relied on airdropping, and that was what I did that I'm real proud of. We proved that you could supply large units by airdropping. And I think I told you about how we would locate places they could drop. The trucks did follow the road as it progressed up through the jungle, as did the pipeline. So we were able to travel farther. We could travel from the end of the road. And my camp moved, my truck camp moved as the pipeline moved. And we wound up at Michinaw, where we had a real rough battle. And I was in on that thing accidentally. I was trying to hitchhike back to base headquarters and tried to get a ride on a plane at Shimbawang. And at that time, they said you had to have orders to ride. But I found a pilot who would let me on, but he says, something's going on, says you'll have to stay in the can until we take off. Said, I saw General Olds out here. Well, when we took off, I was about to smother to death, and I came out, and everywhere I looked, there was a C-47 with a glider behind it. And I said, we don't have one of those. He said, yes, congratulations, you're going to be in on the invasion of Michinaw. We dropped the gliders. They took the airfield from the Japs. The gliders mostly crashed, but they were supposed to. No one was hurt so far as I knew. They had baby bulldozers and stuff like that. They repaired the airfield, and we went and landed twice that night. On the last trip, I could hear a lot of firing, and the town, what was left of it, had been under heavy bombardment for a long time. Maybe 100 Japs were left there. Well, they gave the Chinese the honor of going in and taking the town, and one group of Chinese was on one side and one on the other, and they were doing a little looting and what was left, and for some reason, one of them fired across town. The other side returned the fire. They almost annihilated each other, and in the confusion, the Japs moved back in. That was in May. We finally took Michinaw with a tremendous loss of American and other lives in August, just from that blunder. So that was the heaviest combat I ever got in, and I missed most of that.
Well, the tape hasn't ended yet. Would you like to just keep on talking about?
I can tell you a funny story about a tiger hunt, which is different.
All right, I hope we'll have enough tape for it. Yes, do that.
Well, I saw a Naga with a piece of a jawbone of some animal on the little strap that held his knife and scabbard for his knife, and wanted to know what that was, and that meant he was a tiger hunter. He'd killed a tiger. So I wanted to know if there were tigers around there. I'd been there about 2 weeks, and things were sort of settling down a little, and the Japs had moved out. And they said yes, and I wanted to know where to get one. They said at the salt spring, which was nearby. And so I arranged without telling anybody, for I think 6 of them to go with me to hunt the tiger. The deal was we would go down and get in this big banyan tree by the salt lick, which was a big mud hole. and wait for the tiger to come, and I'd have a flashlight, and they would hold the flashlight while I shot the tiger. But when it started down there, I began to get second thoughts about it. They only were armed with spears. One of them had an old muzzle-loading shotgun that didn't even have a lock on it. That thing probably dated the first European appearance in Burma, but anyway, we went. I had one of these GI gooseneck flashlights. You had to shake them to get them to come on. We get there and help each other up in a tree. It's about 8 feet to the nearest limb, a huge tree. As it got dark, we heard all sorts of small animals coming and going, and then all of a sudden we hear the roar of a tiger. I'd never heard one before, but you knew what it was. Little animals started taking off, and they started saying to each other, chong, 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 which I knew was their word for tiger, and that's about all I knew of their language. Pretty soon the tiger was right under the tree, and I didn't have any trouble shaking to get this, but I finally got that flashlight to come on briefly, and I looked down and I see the jaws of this tiger. It looked like the biggest thing that ever lived with more teeth, and my flashlight went out. Well, I was armed with a Tommy gun and a pistol. Not very good tiger weapon. I looked around for my fierce tiger hunting friends and realized I was alone in that damn tree. They'd left as soon as they heard the tiger. There was no way that I could hold the light and hold on to the tree, and I was probably shaking too much to shoot anyway. So I got as high as I could in that tree and held on for dear life till just about dawn after I'd heard the tiger way off in the distance. I went home. I didn't tell anybody to the war. That's the most unheroic tiger hunt anybody ever made.
Well, we're almost finished, but what would you have done with the tiger if you'd gotten it?
Well, I hadn't thought that far ahead, but I thought it'd be nice to have a tiger skin.
Oh, well, so you would have brought that home with you.
Well, that was in the back of my mind, but I don't know, it seemed like a good idea to go kill the tiger. After that, I never wanted to bother one anymore. I saw his tracks several times. They were big as dinner plates, the huge tiger, and they were very, very prevalent in the area. In fact, there were more tigers in the Hukong Valley of Burma and the hills surrounding it than any other place in the world. They even had tigers down there the Kachins called ghost tigers, but that's a long story. We can't go into that.
Well, the tape is just ending there, so this is a good place to stop. Well, thank you so much.